Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the hearing for the inquiry into the Crimes Amendment Display of Nazi Symbols Bill 2021. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which Parliament House sits. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal persons who may be present during the hearing. Today's hearing is being conducted as a virtual hearing. This enables the work of the committee to continue during the COVID-19 pandemic without compromising the health and safety of members, witnesses and staff. We will be hearing from representatives and peak organisations of the Jewish and Hindu communities and not-for-profit educational and civil rights organisations. As well, we will be hearing from the Deputy Commissioner of Investigations and Counter-Terrorism of the New South Wales Police Force. Before going any further, I'd like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. While parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses giving evidence, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of their evidence at the virtual hearing. I would therefore caution witnesses to be careful about comments you may make to the media or to others after you complete your evidence. Committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. In that regard, it's important that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take a question on notice and provide an answer within 7 days, and we're adopting that time frame as we have a fairly prompt need to report our deliberations to Parliament. Today's proceedings are being recorded and a transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. Finally, there are a few matters that I should raise in terms of virtual hearing etiquette, if I could put it that way, to minimise disruptions and assist those who take down a transcript from Hansard. So can I ask committee members to clearly identify who questions are directed to, and could I ask everyone to please state their name when they begin speaking? Could everyone please mute their microphones when they're not speaking? And members and witnesses should avoid speaking over each other so we can all be heard clearly. I'm now going to welcome our first witnesses. Could I start with Mr. Wertheim, then Mr. Bark and Mr. Jane? Could you state your full name and position and your position title? And then swear either an oath or affirmation from the cards that you've been emailed by our Secretariat. So may I start with Mr. Wertheim?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Peter John Wertheim. I'm the co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jury and an Honorary Life Deputy of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. Would you like me to swear the oath now?
Yes, please.
I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you, Mr. Wertheim. Mr. Bark.
Aaron Bark, Chief Executive Officer of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
And finally, Mr. Jane.
Surinder Jain, National Vice President of the Council of Australia. I swear that the evidence I will give will be truth and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jain. We're going to start by the committee offering each of you, or each organisation perhaps might be more appropriate, the opportunity to make a brief opening statement, and then we'll get into questions. Might I invite, first of all, the Jewish Board of Deputies. Would it like to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Chair. We would.
Well, please proceed. Yeah.
Thank you. Chair, Deputy Chair and committee members, thank you for inviting us to appear before you today to discuss the Crimes Amendment Act Display of Nazi Symbols Bill 2021. We also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, past, present and emerging. We'd like to thank the Honourable Walter Court, MLC, for introducing the legislation into the Parliament. The New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, the peak representative body of the Jewish community here in New South Wales, welcomes this bill and the opportunity to comment on this important piece of legislation currently before the committee today. We have worked alongside the Hindu Council of Australia to prepare our joint submission. The display of Nazi symbols is of concern to both our communities. We thank the Hindu Council of Australia for working with us. We acknowledge Surinder Jain, the National Vice President, Hindu Council of Australia, who is appearing before you today as well. Our collaboration is for a better society and a safer society, and this bill is a key element to facilitating that. This legislation is a positive step for our multicultural, inclusive and diverse society. Just last week, we commemorated the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, January the 27th, marking 77 years since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the beginning of the end of the Holocaust, during which 6 million Jews and millions of others were targeted and murdered by the Nazi regime. A symbol of peace for thousands of years, the Nazi regime manipulated the Hindu swastika into the hooked cross, which resembles the Hindu swastika, and used it as a propaganda tool across the world to intimidate, train and enlist followers and impose hate, suffering and death on millions of people. And now we see the re-emergence of these symbols for the same purposes. In 2020 alone, the Nazi flag was displayed 31 times here in New South Wales. And normalising these symbols is the first step to forgetting, a critical step to history repeating itself. A dark time in history that broke humanity and caused immense suffering across the world. The use of the Nazi symbols is a gateway to something a lot more sinister, to something a lot more dangerous. And this legislation has to address these issues before they manifest into something more. These symbols hide so much more behind them. As the tip of the iceberg, early intervention, alongside education, empowers both government and society to act, to do something, before that view manifests into something that results in violence or loss in life. There is a growing threat to the entire Australian community by extremist racist groups. These groups hold recruitment and training sessions. They fly flags with Nazi symbols, and they engage in Nazi-style rituals, including the Hitler salute, inciting and encouraging physical and verbal attacks against Australians, particularly minority groups within our society. History is teaching us that now is the time to act. So let us join the 12 countries and nations around the world that have taken this action. We welcome the amendments to the Crimes Act to offer further protections in the form of a ban on hate symbols. A ban on Nazi symbols demonstrates that New South Wales is taking a strong stance against extremism, neo-Nazi groups, and against radicalisation. We ask to curtail this recruitment and let's learn the lessons of history. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Could I commence by asking Reverend Nall or Miss Boyd if they'd like to ask the opening question?
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering if Mr. Jane wanted to make an opening statement.
Thank you for drawing that to my attention. It's a terrible omission on my part, and I apologise, Mr. Jane, for overlooking you. Would you like to make your opening statement now? Thank you.
Yes, please. Honourable Chair, Deputy Chair and committee members, I represent the Hindu Council of Australia, a big body of Hindus in Australia with chapters in every state. I also acknowledge the landowners. I want to thank Honourable Secord and New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies for discussing this bill with us. It wasn't easy. Both sides have emotions connected to this. For the Jewish community, it is fear and terror. For Hindus, it is icon of faith which we are not able to display in public. About 100 years ago, evil arose in the name of Nazi in Europe, causing a world war and many deaths. Jewish community was particularly targeted, leading to Holocaust, but non-Europeans also suffered. The evil misappropriated a likeness of swastika, calling it Hakenkreuz. A display of Hakenkreuz sent shivers of fear in many. It invokes hate and is a reminder of an evil chapter in human history. Public display of such symbols of hate is a reminder of evil deeds and must be banned. Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists all over the world have been using swastika as a symbol of peace, prosperity, purity for thousands of years. Given the resemblance between Hakenkreuz and swastika, we are not able to display our sacred symbol of peace in public without invoking fear and scorn. Our sacred symbol, meant for public display of our faith, has become an indoor-only icon. We urge the committee to ban hate symbol of Hakenkreuz and free our sacred symbol of swastika from its indoor prison. Public education of the difference between the two will strengthen Australian multiculturalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jane. Mr. Wertheim, you didn't want to add anything to Mr. Bark's earlier statement, did you?
I would only add one sentence, if I may.
Yep, thank you.
The Jewish community, as Mr. Bark indicated, overwhelmingly supports this bill, and the recommendations in the Board of Deputies for adjustments aimed at clarifying and refining certain aspects of the bill. So this does not in any way detract from our support for it.
Thank you very much. Again, I ask Reverend Nile or Abigail Boyd whether they'd like to commence. Thank you, Abigail.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to our witnesses for attending today and for your detailed submissions and support for the bill. I'd like to begin by asking a question, perhaps of you, Mr. Bark or Mr. Wertheim. In the discussion around this bill, there has been talk about limiting extremism and trying to deal with the kind of scourge of neo-Nazism, which is, I guess, becoming more prominent at the moment. But also, there seems to be a second reason put forward for the bill in the discussion, which is more about the real trauma and hurt and harm caused to Jewish people from seeing the Nazi symbols. From your perspective, which of those is, I guess, driving your support for this bill? And could you elaborate perhaps on just how damaging the trauma is from seeing Nazi symbols.
Well, perhaps I can begin and then Mr. Barr can add if he wishes. That's okay. The Jewish community in Australia has a higher percentage of Holocaust survivors and descendants than any Jewish community in the world outside of Israel. I'm not talking absolute numbers, I'm talking percentages. And so the impact of seeing Nazi symbols displayed in any kind of public context evokes memories, both personal and intergenerational and historical, that simply limit the capacity of Jews to go about their normal lives with the sort of safety and security that you would expect of any citizen, as the right of any citizen. That's the primary impact. But it's also important to acknowledge the point that has been made by his own and by Mr. Jay, that the display of Nazi symbols also has an impact on the wider community. And that in itself is perhaps more sinister in the long run. The effects are more long-lasting. The impact of the display of Nazi symbols, people walking into shopping centres wearing a swastika armband as a Nazi symbol, is to normalise, firstly, the whole horror, Nazism, to get people used to it, to kill off their normal feelings of revulsion and repugnance at what Nazism was and stood for, and to try to make it a banal and normal part of Australian life as a prelude to much worse to follow. That is the pattern that we have to learn from history, and that is precisely why nipping the display of Nazi symbols in the park is so important. It's not just for the benefit of the Jewish community or for the Hindu community in terms of education about the swastika. It's for the wider community. It's for our own society.
Do you think then, sorry, just to leap on that, so do you think then that passing the bill would also provide an opportunity for re-educating people about the Holocaust? Because I think especially younger generations seem to have they don't really grasp the horror of the Holocaust, and the perhaps it's too far back in history for some people. But do you think this would provide a chance for education, and perhaps that would help with levels of anti-Semitism as well in the community?
Well, firstly, the premise of your question is absolutely correct. There was a study released just last week by the Gandalf Foundation about the level of Holocaust in the Australian community. And one of the many findings that's of relevance here, and in answer to your question, is that the younger the person who was surveyed, the less knowledge of the Holocaust there needed to be. So that the further away in time we get from the Holocaust, and the more remote those historical events become from the personal experiences of people, the less knowledge they have about them, the less they understand them. So there is definitely a need for fortifying education about those things, not just as an event of history, but for the health of our own democracy and our society that's built on social cohesion and mutual respect. So yes, there is definitely a need for it, and that's why passing this legislation will, I hope, act as a signal to the wider community that Nazism remains as odious as it has always been since the Second World War in this country, and that there is no let-up in the public perception of Nazism. But also it needs to be allied with a broader approach in government, in terms of public school education in particular, to reinforce that message. I mean, legislation can do a certain amount, but at the end of the day, education needs to be done with the legislation, reinforce the message, and to give young people in particular the intellectual and moral tools that they need to grasp the appropriate lessons from history.
Thank you, Peter. I might ask another member, perhaps an opposition member now, if they'd like to ask a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. May I take the opportunity? Yes, I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Wertheim. Now, in December, the Executive Council of Australian Jury's annual report into anti-Semitism by your research officer, Julie Nathan, revealed that in 2021, there was a 35% increase in Australia in anti-Semitic incidents. How would restricting or curbing the use of Nazi symbols impact on that? Could I get your comments on that, please?
Yes. Well, the report actually, for the last 2 years, has detailed how pervasive the display of Nazi symbols has become compared to previous years where it was unheard of. The reports include the flying of Nazi flags in public, the use of Nazi symbols in graffiti in the streets, an increase in advertised Nazi memorabilia and jewellery using the Hakenkreuz as well as SS Lightning bolts and Sonnenrads, the Nazi sun wheel. The reports also document the occasions when the Hakenkreuz was displayed from private homes in Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania, when people dressed in SS uniforms, wearing Kreuz armbands, have entered places of business to do their shopping or other business, and the impact of that on desensitising the wider community.
Yeah, Mr. Wertheim, may I just ask, what is your response to someone dressing up in a Nazi uniform and walking into a shop? How does that impact on the community?
Well, it leaves the community completely devastated that something like that, which we all thought had been left behind in Europe in the 1940s, has now managed to make an appearance in peaceful democratic Australia, a place where many Holocaust survivors and their descendants found sanctuary and safety, and discovering that something that they thought was a closed chapter of history and something that really only appeared in their nightmares and their memories is now actually making an appearance as some part of normal life in Australia. And that is devastating. It is psychologically devastating. It is also paralysing, because how does one react as a person who might have survived the camp, seeing that? How are they supposed to react? I mean, the impulse might be to take the law into their own hands and do something, which, of course, would not be the appropriate response, but a very hidden response. So what is one to do? Nobody should be put in that position. Nobody should be confronted with it. And the wider community also shouldn't be exposed to it because of the impact of that.
Mr. Chair, may I ask one more question?
Yes.
I'd like to ask it to Mr. Bark and to Mr. Jain. Now, it was quite extraordinary that the Jewish and Hindu communities have launched or lodged a joint submission to this inquiry. I find that landmark and extraordinary. Mr. Bark and Mr. Jain, can you tell me why the Jewish and Hindu communities, as well as the Buddhist and Jain communities, came together to make this submission? Mr. Bark? And then I'll ask Mr. Jain the same question.
Thank you, Mr. Secord. I think what's really important is that, to Peter Wertheim's point, is that these symbols represent behind them so much, which is that dehumanisation of millions of people and their ancestry. But they also represent the hijacking of a symbol that was used by the Hindus that represents peace. And so that misappropriation of imagery, propaganda's sake, that representation of the death and dehumanisation. Those elements together are deeply impactful on both of our communities. And to the point that was made earlier about dovetailing with education, Jewish Board of Deputies, the Jewish community and the Hindu Council of Australia are looking at education opportunities because we do have a track record when it comes to combating racial and religious hatred and complementing the work that the New South Wales government has done in that space. So when we look at what the educational opportunities are, especially in light of the Deakin University statistics showing that especially millennials have a gap in their understanding of Holocaust and what they represent, there is an opportunity for both of our communities to come together to outline those particular meanings, work together on education, but also to demonstrate why a bill such as this is good for all of New South Wales and all of our communities.
Thank you.
Even outside of ours.
Thank you. Mr. Jain?
Well, our community is not able to display our symbol in public. And that's the reason when this bill came, we got together with the Jewish community to see how we can have both sides satisfied with this. And as I said in my opening statement, it's not an easy process when emotions are involved, emotions of fear, there are your very own existence, and emotions of faith. And what we have achieved, I think, is outstanding. It shows that by getting together, by discussions, we can solve even the most difficult problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jain, I wonder if you could, I'm going to ask a few questions to all the witnesses now about the actual provisions of the bill. I presume you've seen the bill, Mr. Jain?
Yes, I have.
Yes. Are you happy with the definition of the Hakenkreuz and other items that are to be prohibited as outlined in the bill?
Well, we definitely say that the meaning of Nazi symbol needs to be expanded a little bit, and swastika specifically should be excluded. Swastika, when it is being used for a religious purpose, should be permitted. Now, whether it's being used for a religious purpose, is it some mischievous person claiming I'm using it for a religious purpose? I think that should be determined by, say, Hindu Council of Australia, rather than going through court litigation in the court deciding what a religious use of a symbol is or is not.
Thank you. Does the Jewish Board of Deputies have anything to add on that particular issue?
Just to, in relation to the Nazi symbol definition, we outlined that prescriptive symbols can be problematic, and ultimately having a symbol that contains elements of or variation of the symbol would be something that would provide an enhancement to the bill.
Do you believe, Mr. Bark, do you believe it should be extended to, I think, apologies if I don't remember the actual terms, I think it was the Sonnengrad?
Peter King.
Sonnengrad, that's right. I added a G. And the other one whose name I completely forget, which is based around the skull and crossbones. Either Darren or Peter, are you happy with the way the bill's been written in that respect?
Yes, we are. The bill defines Nazi symbol in a broad enough sense for a court to look. I think on the basis of expert evidence from historians, if need be. or just figures in the Jewish or the Hindu communities, as the case may require, to make that judgment. But it would be broad enough to apply not only to the Hakenkreuz but also to the Totenkopf, I think is the one you were referring to, and to Sonnenrad, and there are many other Nazi and neo-Nazi symbols that have been advised all the time, many of them for use online. And I believe that the bill can drawn quite well in that regard to be able to capture, to be flexible enough to capture innovations in Nazi symbols that go well beyond Hakenkreuz to all sorts of other symbols. The typical online one, for example, is the triple echoes symbol. It's triple parentheses.
Yeah.
A now well recognised Nazi symbol.
All right, to just go on to another issue, in similar laws in Europe, for example, in the Serbian law and the German law, production and storage is outlawed. Production is also outlawed in the Ukrainian and Polish legislation. It's also not illegal in various European laws to have a private collection. That would also be the case in New South Wales, and it's not proposed that the New South Wales law cover production either. Are you happy with the fact that the law is limited in that way here in New South Wales? Or proposed law?
We would accept that the primary evil that needs to be addressed, and which this bill does address, is the display in public of Nazi symbols.
Right. Finally, Mr. Barker, Mr. Wertheim, I imagine you're in contact, of course, with similar Jewish organisations around the world, including in countries which have laws like this. You'd be aware in the proposed law there's an exemption process which is proposed to be given to the President of the Anti-Discrimination Board. In other jurisdictions that have got these sorts of laws, what has been typically the volume of material that's been required to go through these exemption laws, and do you, well, I'll leave it there and then I have one brief follow-up to it too.
May I ask a question too, Mr. Chair?
Of course. The volume. So it's a question about the volume and the efficacy of the exemption processes that might apply elsewhere. We don't have much of that information, any information about that in front of us. We have got a submission from the Anti-Discrimination Board, which you've probably had a chance to see, and I'm just trying to get my head around the issue that submission raises.
Well, that is a point that is the subject of one of the proposed amendments in the Board of Deputies submission. The volume probably would not be, the volume could be very great if the only way of obtaining a defence or precluding a prosecution under the legislation were to obtain an exemption in advance from the Anti-Discrimination Board. That, as the submission says, would be a cumbersome process, a time-consuming process, both for the applicant and for the Anti-Discrimination Board, if it has to be done in every case. There are going to be many instances where, for example, a school or a university will want to display some historical footage of the Nazi period. In fact, one of the most famous documentaries about Nazism is called The Twisted Cross. And so it necessarily involves a display of the Hakenkreuz and other Nazi symbols as an incident to educating people about Nazism and the evils of Nazism. To require every teacher in every school at every university to have to get an exemption in advance every time
Got 10 minutes left.
a documentary is filmed or every time there's a film that covers the Nazi period. There's an incident displaying the evils of Nazism, image of the Hakenkreuz. It does seem to be unwieldy,
Right.
and
So,
a better way would appear to be to have an exemption or a defence in the legislation.
So I was going to come to that point just in conclusion. You think it would perhaps be more viable to just have those matters as defences rather than a separate process?
Correct, and that's what the submission has,
Good.
recommended.
Thank you very much. Reverend Niall, would you like to ask a question at this point?
Thank you for attending our inquiry. One of the issues that has concerned me in recent years has been the development of groups of young men forming a Nazi group, wearing Nazi symbols, uniforms, and holding parades in our western suburbs of Sydney. What action should we be taking to prevent that kind of activity, and does that concern you, that activity?
Well, I think the point that you make in regards to certain groups using these symbols is an important one, because these symbols, as
Mr. Chair, I wonder if I do a slight technical point of order. I'm not sure if anyone else can't hear Mr. Bark, but I can barely hear him, but everyone else is coming through okay. So I don't know if Mr. Bark can maybe get more close to his microphone. But I'm not sure if anyone else has that problem. I just want to point that out.
Yep.
Is that better, or is that?
I think that is better. Most of us, well, we certainly were able to hear here, but I'm not sure about everyone who's online. So thank you, Darren.
I was able to get online.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll if that happens again, just let me know.
Thank you.
So just what was being alluded to previously is that these symbols have been used as recruitment tools in person, but particularly online. I mean, there's been quite a bit of recent media coverage in relation to this and the rise of right-wing extremism. And the use of these symbols really embolden and recruit people to those causes. So when they're being used to recruit, they also target the most vulnerable people as well. So we should be protecting those that are vulnerable in the community, in fact, all of the community, from these symbols being used as recruitment tools and as propaganda tools. Because what has been outlined is that the use and the continual use of these images and the prevalence increasing, which is what we see in the statistics, is that the normalisation of these symbols occurs. That's the first step for us to forgetting that the horrors of the ethnic cleansing that took place. And that will then result, that forgetting is that step to this being repeated. So for all of those reasons, I think it's a very good point that has been made. And we do need to address those symbols being used specifically by those groups to get more and more people on that cause to harm groups of people.
Thank you very much, Darren. Is there a government member who'd like to ask a question? I think it's Mr. Mallard.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yep.
Thank you,
I'll come
Mr.
to you in a
Chair, and
minute.
thank you, gentlemen, for your detailed submission on the proposed legislation. First, I just want to say to Mr. Jane that I was a councillor in the City of Sydney and very involved with the issue around the swastika display in the entry to Customs House. Beautiful display, but quite confronting. It was the first time I discovered the appropriation of that symbol by where it came from by the Nazis. They didn't have that awareness until that time. There's a sign there that explains what it means, and staff are regularly educated so they can talk to the public. But it's quite a confronting lesson there about that theft of your symbol. And I guess that goes towards the issue of education and awareness that you've rightly suggested should be part of the approach to this legislation. So I just want to make the observation in regard to Customs House, so it's very much in the front of mind and right down there at Circular Quay. I just want to touch on the issue of the Victorian Social Issues Committee did an inquiry into this very similar legislation.
Only got 5
and the
minutes now.
government decided to go down the path of banning the swastika,
Could you get to your question, Shane? We've got 5 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep.
I just want, the question I want to ask is there's the issue of targeting specific symbols, or issue of amending the anti-discrimination legislation and toughening it up to make it more effective, because we did amend it in 2018 and you pointed out it hasn't resulted in any change. What would you say to that approach of broadening out the approach to more hate symbols and toughening up the legislation as a response to this this concern of growing radicalisation?
Well, this is criminal legislation that we're talking about, as distinct from the Anti-Discrimination Act, which is, more human rights legislation. And I think criminalising the display of the public display of Nazi symbols sends a very specific and very important message that we've been discussing just now. And it's a different message from saying to private individuals who might be offended or insulted or feel that contempt is directed towards them as a result of that display, but they're on their own and they have to lodge a private complaint and prosecute it through the Anti-Discrimination Board. That shouldn't be the case with something as serious as this. It should be the state prosecuting the offender and bringing the resources of the state to do so, and also authority of the state to send the appropriate message. So
I think that's a good answer to that.
Conduct is unacceptable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Farlow might like to ask a question.
Or Mr. Primrose.
Let's see, we've got 2 minutes left, so this is probably going to be the last question, unless it's very brief. So, Peter, as brief as you can.
Very briefly, we heard evidence earlier about the report that the Nazi flag had been flown 31 times in New South Wales in 2020, and that's according to the report. Were there any particular public locations chosen that you would believe would be have indicated that was an aggravated matter, or where would it actually been from? I wonder if you could cite any examples, please. I'm thinking about, I remember reading something about opposite a synagogue in Newtown, for example.
Yes, look, from public homes, they were in country towns. One from memory was on the top of a tower. I can't remember whether it was a... Yeah. I mean, there doesn't be any logical to it, but it wasn't confined to the sun. It just seems to crop up wherever you get particular individuals who, for whatever reasons, have been have succumbed to that kind of ideology.
Yeah, my simple point is, Mr. Chair, is, and can I just ask the witness that I presume in many instances these were done to cause particular, as a grievance or to aggravate other people, such as you mentioned occurred in Newtown.
Look, it can. Sometimes it's just because somebody wants to make a political statement, or what they see as a political statement. And sometimes it's done very deliberately, again, to get people used to the display of Nazi symbols, to desensitise them to it,
In addition to the desensitization, it's to elicit fear and intimidation in those that are around where it's displayed. So that's why we see it at synagogues. We see it on Bondi Beach. We see it in a number of different areas where it will have that maximum impact. And if it's been used in other areas, such as regional New South Wales, we can see that it's used as a recruitment tool. So it either falls into those two categories or both. to desensitalise or to normalise the appearance of it, to recruit people towards a particular cause, but to also elicit fear and intimidation in those where it is displayed. And all three of those things taking place is a very dangerous combination.
Finally, a quick question from Scott Farlow.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I didn't think I was going to get that chance, but anyways. Look, just to return to Mr. Mallard's point on the Victorian inquiry, there were some suggestions in the Victorian inquiry from the Jewish Community Council of Victoria that there was potential in just choosing the swastika, and I'll quote from their submission to the report of the inquiry, that if you just ban the swastika, they'll find another symbol, be it that white supremacist hand movement, there was a soldier who was filmmaking that symbol, and it continues on. I just wanted to have the board's view on that view, that potentially that if you were to ban the swastika and were to ban Nazi symbols, that there would be other symbols that would be used to incite the same kind of movement.
Perhaps I could answer that question, because the Jewish Community Council of Victoria is one of our constituents, along with
Thank you, Mr. Whitehead.
Board of Deputies. And look, I think the thinking in Victoria has moved on as a result of that very point. Initially, it was, I think, an emotive call, just, ban the swastika. And of course, that didn't take into account all the other Nazi symbols. It didn't take into account the fact that the swastika is a sacred symbol for him, James, and Buddhists. Didn't take into account a lot of things. The thinking, as I understand it, has moved on now and is more along the lines that we've been discussing in the context of this bill. And I think it would be appropriate if New South Wales were once again leader in this. New South Wales was the first state to introduce an Anti-Discrimination Act and also anti-vilification laws. I think it's appropriate that New South Wales would give the lead again, and the thinking here seems to be far more advanced, far more sophisticated, and the sensitivities also of the Hindu, Jain and Buddhist communities have been much more deeply engaged and worked into this draft legislation than has been the case in Victoria in the past. So the long answer, I'm sorry, but I do think that what we're discussing here is now more in line with the thinking in Victoria than perhaps it was originally.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry, Mr. Jane, no. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I said I agree with what has been said by Mr. Wortley.
Yes, good. Thank you very much, Mr. Jane. I appreciate that additional comment. Look, I feel we could talk about this a lot longer with all of you, so I do want to thank you for making your time available, but we do have a number of other witnesses that we need to see during the morning. So, again, thank you very much for your interest and the work you put into your submissions. It's very much appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Righto.
Are we still live, Ms. Treby? Yeah, okay.
Mr. Hudson, good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
Deputy Commissioner.
Indeed. I was going to let him... where's my script gone?
I think he's been sworn in before.
But he'd have to be sworn in for this particular inquiry. Mr. Hudson, welcome. You will have been sent let me see. You will have been sent a copy of the oath or the affirmation. Would you like to take that before you begin your evidence, please?
Yes, sir. I'd like to take the oath. I can indicate I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God.
And could you also please state your full name and position title for the benefit of Hansard as well, please?
So my full name is David William Hudson, spelled Hudson, Deputy Commissioner of Police, currently in the investigations and counter-terrorism portfolio.
Thank you very much. And would you like to start by making a short statement?
Just a very short statement, sir. I can indicate and I thank you for the opportunity for the New South Wales Police Force to comment on the proposed draft bill. I think I speak for our entire organisation that we have no tolerance for Nazi symbols, and as with the majority of mainstream Australia, find them abhorrent and distasteful. This not only relates to their historical use, but also their current use by some ontologically violent extremist groups, which are used to spread hate and incite hate crimes. I can indicate that any criticism I may have of the draft bill is not in relation to its intent, but in relation to the mechanics of how it might operate. Thank you.
Good. I think I will start this time with an opposition member. Would an opposition member like to ask the Deputy Commissioner the first question?
Yes. Thank you, Deputy Commissioner, for participating. I'm Walt Secord. I'm the Shadow Minister for Police. We heard evidence earlier, documented evidence, that the Nazi flag had been flown 31 times in New South Wales in 2020, and that was the subject of a Freedom of Information request to I think the Department of Justice at the time. 31 times, including a water tower in Wagga Wagga and a backyard of a home in Newtown across from the Newtown Synagogue. So what do police do at the moment if they find someone parading with a Nazi flag or displaying a Nazi flag, other than making a film or engaging in a play such as The Diary of Anne Frank? What do the New South Wales Police do at the moment?
So it would be very much dependent upon the circumstances of each individual incident, and I don't have those in front of me. In particular circumstances, it would be a matter for the police, and if it's used to incite any type of violence or anger within the community, it would be the police would be speaking to the individuals who are in possession of that particular Nazi flag, and I presume you're talking about the swastika.
Yes.
And at the moment, we are heavily reliant upon 93Z of the Crimes Act, the hate crime section, which requires an intent to incite violence. So in the absence of any incitement of violence, it could be an interpretation of the individual police, depending upon the circumstances, that it constitutes offensive behaviour. It might not, depending upon those circumstances. So every one of those 20 incidents that have been acknowledged this morning...
Sorry, 31. It was 31.
Sorry, 31 would be very different, and depending upon the individual circumstances of those 31 incidents, the response would have been different.
Now, yesterday, the federal government announced $24.5 million in funding to target extremist far right-wing groups in rural and regional areas. Now, I remember from previous budget estimates that we asked a line of questions about extreme right-wing activity in New South Wales, and we found that in Orange last year, there was an incident of someone who had a Nazi flag in their home, and they had arrested for organizing and working with 3D printing of weapons. What is your view on extremists in rural and regional areas in New South Wales?
We're seeing an increase in extremist behaviour through COVID lockdowns, especially recruitment and engagement online. Many of the individuals and most of the last arrests we have made in relation to extremist behaviour, right-wing extremist behaviour, have been in rural New South Wales, including the South Coast, all the way down to Albury and indeed Orange, as you've referred to. So probably still see the major threat for New South Wales as being religiously based violence, rather than ideologically based crime. And that is concurrent and in agreement with the AGO threat assessment, However, we certainly are seeing the increase in right-wing extremism, engagement in right-wing activity online, threading through to requiring policing activity, as we took in Orange, and we've taken in a number of other places where we believe that threat was reaching to a stage where it's unacceptable.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for what you do and what the men and women in the New South Wales Police are doing to protect the community from these elements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secord. Deputy Commissioner, I might ask a few questions now. A similar inquiry was held recently on this matter in Victoria in their parliament, and some of the submissions that were received there argued that banning a symbol may unintentionally give it more power as a recruiting tool, and that a preferable approach is to draft laws based on principles that allow all offensive symbols to be banned perhaps sometime in the future. Do you have any comments on that view?
So I've long held the view that one of the gaps in our current legislation, more at a Commonwealth level than a state level, is in relation to the possession of extremist material. We put a proposal through the Australian and New Zealand Counter-Terrorism Committee in 2017 when they were seeking legislative suggestions that an offence be created for possession of extremist material. We undertaken large amounts of operational activity in the counter-terrorism space. And not all resulting, obviously, in offences that are put before the court, but also interdicting with suspects on a pathway that we deem that the risk is unacceptable and we have to intervene. We find a large amount of extremist material, and I'm referring to not just right-wing extremism in relation to Nazi symbols or swastikas or Nazi flags, but we also find ISIS flags. We find Al-Qaeda publications in Spy magazine teaching people how to blow up government buildings and cause bushfires and set fire to government buildings and icons. We find publications of the Ramia ISIS magazine espousing similar type suggestions, and at the moment is not an offence to possess those materials. So we put a suggestion through that be considered on a very broad range, and then in any material that we did seize or detect through our investigations have some nexus to some violence offence. That was put before the Parliamentary Joint Committee for Intelligence and Security at the Commonwealth, I believe, last year, and that committee has yet to report, but that's been a piece of work that we see would be very useful to law enforcement in relation to managing.
Yes, certainly. Deputy Commissioner, sceptics of this sort of legislation also argue that by banning it, or banning either displays or possession of this sort of material, you're just driving it underground, and it will in fact, how shall I say, constrain people like yourselves working in counter-terrorism and your capacity basically to keep an eye on things and make sure our community's safe. What do you say to those sorts of sceptics?
That is certainly a worthy comment, sir. I think that we utilise people who brazenly tout Nazi symbols, and it's certainly an indicator of their intent and their motivations. I don't think prohibition of anything historically has probably been proven to be ineffective. When you force something underground.
Effective or ineffective? Sorry, Commissioner, did you say effective or ineffective?
prohibition has rarely been effective.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think that when you force something underground, it gains a separate mystique and attraction to certain individuals. And to be perfectly honest, when we talk about this, and I don't want to be sound too uncomplimentary, but we're not dealing with people who are mainstream Australia. When we have individuals who align themselves to a right-wing, ideologically extreme right-wing ideology, and the type of individuals that we deal with will certainly be attracted to the prohibition, I would suggest, of this type of symbol.
So if I may ask one last question, despite those concerns, nevertheless, your view was that, as expressed through participation in other fora and at perhaps the federal inquiry, it's better to actually make it illegal to possess it. Have I got that right, or have I misunderstood your evidence?
I think the intent for us is to try and restrict its use and try and, our responsibility would be to create that nexus between the symbol itself and intended behaviour. And that would be our responsibility to do that. And if that behaviour and nexus could be proven, then in our view, an offence would be justified.
Yeah, thank you. Reverend Niall or Abigail, at this stage?
Yes, just a quick question.
Yep.
Have you had any problems with the well-intentioned young men who joined the police force who may have some sympathies for neo-Nazism? Has there been any attempt to ensure in their training that they're clearly taught this is a no-go area?
So we have a very strong statement of values which is contained in our Police Act. I would suggest that support for neo-Nazi groups would not be in accordance with those statement of values. In placing integrity above all, upholding the rule of law, and also being representative in engagement and engaging with our community. So I would suggest that through our psychological assessments done through prior to people joining, anyone displaying an over support of neo-Nazi groups, I would hope, and I'm sure our Commissioner would hope, would be filtered out before they join the police force.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One brief question, Abigail, at this stage, and then we'll come back again to you later.
Sure. Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. I just wanted to ask you a question coming off of those last questions. So in the previous session, I was discussing with the witnesses that this law is really about sort of two separate goals, if you like. One is to prevent the harm done to Jewish people, and particularly Holocaust survivors, in relation to sort of having to look at Nazi symbols. But then, of course, the other object of the bill is around addressing this extremism. And that's, I guess, where you come in. I'm just wondering, in terms of your comments about whether or not it sort of pushes the youth underground or perhaps makes it more difficult to identify extremists, does the fact that the bill is only looking at the display of the symbol as opposed to the possession of the symbol help reach that sort of, I guess, compromise between protecting Jewish people versus actually being able to identify extremists who are using the symbol?
Ma'am, I certainly sympathise, and I think everyone would, with those of the Jewish faith who would be exposed to these type of symbols based on their history. And I think that I don't think any normal person would have that opinion. I think certainly display of symbols is a problem, and however, you know, from a personal point of view, this is very much a personal view, point of view, it's very much part of our history. And, you know, that's, I think, well said by George Santayana many years ago that those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. So our problem, I think, in the mechanics of the operation of the draft bill is in relation to some of the publications that are already in existence, which are educational or academic, and how they are dealt with. And I don't think it's realistic for bookstores or for movie theatres to seek exemptions from the Anti-Discrimination Board before display or publish a movie based on historical practices. So I think there are some mechanical issues when we look at how it might be implemented with the draft bill. But as I said, we don't have an overall disregard for the intent of the bill. I don't think that those of the Jewish faith should have the hooked cross or the swastika waved in their face. And I think there's probably offences that could be proffered under in relation to offensive behaviour, and in certain circumstances under 93Z, the hate crime section as well, in relation to those overt actions.
Sorry, just a follow-up question then. Do you think that the intent of the display is relevant and should be built into the provisions of the bill?
I think the intent of the bill, I think, you know, that there are lessons to be learned from history, and I think if it's done for an academic, educational purpose, so that the ills of the past are never forgotten, then I think that's a valid reason. From a personal point of view, and I speak very much from a personal point of view rather than an organisational point of view on that point. So from an organisational point of view, it would be very difficult to implement. And I would suggest probably quite difficult for the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner to seek exemptions for everywhere without some capture of what's currently displayed out there or currently would be captured by this proposed legislation. I don't think that work's been done. But there would be volumes of things which would be captured by this in relation to movies, books, magazines and educational material that would be captured, I would suggest.
Deputy Commissioner, if I could do a follow-up on that exact point. The Jewish Board of Deputies has suggested, rather than having a separate process that the Anti-Discrimination Board would look prospectively, I should say, at exemptions, that in fact those sort of factors, i.e. academic, artistic, scientific or research purposes or other purposes in the public interest, be a defence. Do you think that might be a defence to a prosecution? Do you think that might be a preferable sort of way of going about it, or would, or do you think the formulation that's in the Act, the bill that's been tabled, is a better approach?
Sir, I would suggest that using a defence can only be used in a prosecution.
Yeah.
So for that defence to be raised and for some involvement of the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner or Board to make a determination on whether an exemption is valid, we would have to launch a prosecution, which I don't think would be appropriate in all cases. As I said, when you're selling books in a bookstore, you're selling educational material, you're viewing a movie or showing a movie, and to prosecute an individual for doing so would, I think, not pass the public interest test, in my opinion.
Right. So therefore, you'd prefer it be explicit in the legislation rather than just a defence that could be raised.
If lawful excuses were written into the Act or the proposed bill,
yeah,
as they are with, say, possession of knives or possession of certain other things, that without lawful excuse was written in there.
That it assists the police in terms of, yeah.
The lawful excuse would have to be considered by the officer attending at the time rather than considered by a court following a prosecution.
Thank you for that. Mr. Primrose, do you have any questions at this stage?
No, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to give my time to Mr. Secord.
Right.
That's okay.
Do you have a question now, or can I throw to one of the members that haven't asked a question?
Okay, I'll just a quick one to Deputy Commissioner Hudson. I just want to interrogate the statement that you made that prohibition has rarely been effective. Many laws that you, in fact, are asked to carry out, to undertake or supervise for the government and for the community involve prohibition. So I just want to clarify to you, do you stand by that statement that prohibition in the carrying out of laws has rarely been effective? That's quite a broad sweeping statement to make.
I think it is a broad sweeping statement, but when we see obviously the amount of illicit drug activity in our community, it's prohibited, but it still happens. So what the point I'm trying to make is that simply by prohibiting Nazi symbols is not going to remove them, and probably not going to serve the purpose that the draft bill is intending. Prohibition would seek to eradicate the symbol, I would suggest, from society, and I don't think that will be achieved by the bill. I think it will be forced underground, and I think it would be used as some badge of honour of those current right-wing extremist groups that currently adhere to that type of ideology.
I just want to also seek a bit of clarification. So the bill does not propose stopping the screening of films with Nazi symbols in it. That is a misinterpretation of the bill. So a film about World War II would not be covered by this. A production of Anne Frank.
Is there
would
a
not.
question?
I'm just going to ask him to comment on this. I just want to make sure that in light of my observations that it does not stop someone selling books about World War II. It does not stop a film about World War II. It does not stop a production of Anne Frank. And I think police officers are highly intelligent members of the community, and they would be able to differentiate between someone marching down the street with a Nazi flag versus a production of Anne Frank. Do you agree with that statement?
Totally.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. Mr. Farlow or Mr. Mallard or Mr. Poulos, do either of you have questions?
I've got one.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair. I've got a few actually. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just actually want to pick up on that point from Mr. Secord. And I think, Deputy Commissioner, this is one of the concerns you've alluded to in it, that this is a fairly strict liability offence when it comes to the display of the symbols, and there's no connection at the moment to intent at all. And I think you were talking about in terms of the display of things such as the ISIS flag and Al-Qaeda and what you've been looking at a federal level. It's sort of a two-part test, hasn't it, that you've sought, where it is the display, but the display has to be connected with a certain intent. Would that be correct in saying?
Yeah, that's correct, sir.
And you were talking before about the lawful excuse. So we've heard the defence mechanism, and as you said, that would have to be with a prosecution. So instead of the Anti-Discrimination Commission vetting whether things were appropriate or not, that would then have to go to the courts effectively to see whether it was a reasonable excuse. Can you tell us how the lawful excuse would, or how you would see the lawful excuse being implemented in legislation such as this?
In other pieces of legislation, circumstances surrounding lawful excuses are actually listed. So they can be taken into consideration by the police who are dealing with the matter at the time. The 31 instances that Mr. Spore spoke about earlier, with the lawful excuse exemption written into the draft bill. They could be taken into consideration at the point of investigation as to whether that was captured by whatever came into legislation, whether that display of those 31 instances that were referred to were done so with a lawful excuse or not.
So, for instance, to Mr Secord's earlier point, you could include things such as a performance of theatre in historical context. You could include historical books and the like. You could include education, for instance, all as lawful excuses in terms of the legislation.
Correct.
Okay, thank you very much. And just one last question from me. With respect to 93Z, we had the criticism, well not criticism, but statement from the Jewish Board of Deputies that there have been no charges brought on the 93Z to date, despite what they say has been increasing incidents of anti-Semitism. Just wondering if you have any comments with respect to that and whether 93Z, as it stands, is fit for purpose.
93Z was reviewed last year. There are currently 2 individuals due to attend court on the 14th of this month charged with offences preferred under 93Z. So it's not correct to say that no prosecutions have been launched. One of the requirements of 93Z is to seek approval from the Director of Public Prosecutions by the police before we have to seek that approval prior to launching a prosecution. The threshold or the penalty for 93Z has increased, although I don't think it's been enacted from 3 to 5 years. So many of these instances that 93Z could be utilised, there is an offence of similar significance, which we don't need Director of Public Prosecution's approval to commence. So most police will proceed with the alternate offence and put those before the court. There have been 6 further instances that we have sought director approval to prosecute, and they have all been declined.
Thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner.
Right, Mr Poulos or Mr Mallard? I think at this stage. Right, Ms Boyd? Ms Boyd, any questions at this stage?
I do have one last one, if I may.
Yes, please.
Just picking up on that lawful excuse, instead of having to go and seek an exemption beforehand and the complications that brings to build it into the Act to have this as a defence. Would it also then capture a situation where a person was, I guess, clueless about what the symbol was that they were displaying? Yeah. So I'm thinking of, for example, a child draws what they think is it's just a pattern and it's left out somewhere that someone could see it. Now, clearly that's not what's intended by the bill, but the current wording would be problematic. What would you suggest in terms of capturing that sort of innocent use, which is not necessarily sort of falling within the heads of artistic or cultural reasons for use?
I mean, the innocent use, in the circumstances you've outlined, obviously would not be prosecuted. Other people of a more mature nature might claim innocent use, and the police may disagree with that innocent use and put the matter before the court and let the court determine whether they had a lawful excuse or not. I think the volume of what might come before us would be, and what would be put before the courts would be significantly diminished if we had an indicator in there of what lawful excuse might be, such as what we've talked about, the educational or historical value or use of slogans and symbols. But innocent use, ignorance of the law has always been determined no defence. But in the circumstances you've outlined, prosecution launched in relation to a child. There'd be other circumstances where innocent youth would be required to be proved in a court of law.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Boyd. Let's see, how are we going? I might ask Sam Walt, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you, Mr. Hart.
Deputy Commissioner, have you had a chance to view the bill that's been tabled in the Parliament? And why I ask that is I'm just wanting to take you to a particular subclause and see if you have an opinion on how user-friendly it will be for the police who have to undertake the enforcement of the provision.
Yes, I have some time. I have a copy, sir.
Yep, that's good. Can I take you to proposed section 93ZA subsection 7, and then in that section the definition, which include outlining what public act will mean? You see that there? Down the bottom of page 3 of the proposed bill. Right. Having a look at subsections A, B and C, or clauses, I should say, A, B and C, have you had any advice or have you formed an opinion on whether the definition there of public act is workable and something that will be relatively straightforward for the police to enforce?
So as I indicated earlier, which comes from in relation to books and publications and educational material and everything else, I think that that public act is quite broad. Without that overriding clause about law written in there somewhere, I think that that is quite broad in its definition. So,
if I understood correctly what you just said, your view would be that that a lawful excuse provision should be attached to that public act definition, or have I got that wrong?
Either lawful excuse needs to be a component of that, or in the substantive offence of in defining the offence itself.
Okay, Abigail, I think you had a follow-up on that issue.
Yeah, thank you. Just on that public act definition, as you'll be aware, that a lot of our laws, when they get applied to social media, can be a little bit tricky or have unintended consequences. What would be your interpretation of this definition then when it comes to a social media post, for example, that was put up 2 years ago? Would that be seen as a public act? Would a person be obliged to go and remove that from 2 years ago? Do you see issues around historical social media use?
It would be problematic because posts and social media accounts don't disappear. So, sitting there as it stands on a social media account for people to view could be considered by definition publication. Because people who access that particular site at a particular time post any legislative change, it would be considered, in my opinion, that that is being broadcast or published to the individual viewing that site.
Mr. Secord, do you have some questions?
Thank you, Chair.
We conclude?
Yes. Deputy Commissioner Hudson, you referred to 93Z, and you said there were 2 incidents that have been recommended for prosecutions. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Yep. Were those 2 incidents, do they relate to the May 2021 Hezbollah Tahrir rally in Lakemba? Is that what you're referring to, or what were those 2 incidents?
So they relate to conflict in the Hindu and Sikh community out of Parramatta. and some social media posts inciting people to violence out in that district. Probably inappropriate as that matters before the court. Probably.
Okay, thank you, sir. I understand. Now, amongst the 6 that were declined, were any of those in relation to the Hasba Tahrir rally in May 2021, where they shouted, "Destroy the Jews and give us the necks of the Jews"?
No, they weren't. There have been 2 anti-Semitic matters referred to the DPP in relation to requesting prosecutions be commenced in relation to 93Z. Both of those have been informed.
Okay, let's make sure we keep within our terms of reference while there are other opportunities for you,
No, I
to ask
understand
these
that.
questions.
I understand
Yep.
that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, anything else, Walt?
I'm fine, thank you,
Okay,
sir.
any other questions from other members of the committee before we conclude?
Thank you, sir.
It appears not. Deputy Commissioner, you do very important work for the community, so thank you very much for the time you've made available this morning. I think your evidence has been particularly helpful to the committee and the work we're doing, so we appreciate it very much. Thank you. And we're giving you an early mark.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
4-minute early mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, and we're going to keep every one of those 4 minutes for our so at this particular point, Which my apologies, I misspoke there. We're ready. Let's go.
We're off.
Good morning. We'll resume our inquiry into the Crimes Amendment Display of Nazi Symbols Bill, and I would like to thank you for attending this hearing, and I'm going to, before we go any further, welcome our next lot of witnesses and also invite them to state their full name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation from the cards that have been emailed to you by the Secretariat. May I commence with Ms Levin?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Naomi Levine. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council. And I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you very much. Dr Rubenstein.
Yes, my name is Dr Colin Rubenstein. I'm the Executive Director of the Australia-Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. And I don't have the card, but I swear the evidence I'm about to give is the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I hope that's adequate.
Just one last little bit. Are you asking for God's help?
He's not.
Of course, as always.
I think you need to then say for the words, so help me God, to finish it.
So help me God.
Thank you very much. Dr Abramovich.
Good morning. Yes, thank you, Chair. Dr. Vera Abramovich, Chairman of the Anti-Defamation Commission, and I swear that the evidence that I shall give will be the truth and the whole truth. And yes, with God help.
So help me God.
Thank you.
Right. Okay then. Let's see, we'll reverse the order this time. Dr Abramovich, would you like to start by making a short statement?
I sure would, and I'll be reading from my notes, and I understand that you've been very strict with about 3 minutes, so I'll try and stick to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today and to share our perspective. This inquiry is the moment of truth for our elected representatives. We now find ourselves in a moral crossroad when the garden of our democracy is being infected by the weeds of intolerance, extremism and anti-Semitism. And this committee and the Parliament has a choice. We can make history and be on the side of the angels, that is the good and decent people of New South Wales and Australia, who love this state and love this country, and who believe in the shared values that bind us, which is democracy, freedom, equality for all, and inclusiveness. Or you can let the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists win by continuing to allow them to proudly and publicly display and celebrate the ultimate emblem of evil, genocide, and racism, the Nazi swastika. And I want to be very clear. The Nazi swastika represents an exterminist policy. Anyone who exhibits and showcases this symbol of Hitler's Third Reich believes in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, in the final solution, in the industrial extermination of millions of Jews and non-Jews. All those calling on a synagogue or a fence or a retirement home or a school or flight in their home dream of a Fourth Reich, of the return of Hitler, of an Australia without Jews, without Muslims, without those who belong to the LGBTIQ+ community, without the disabled, without Australian Asians and African Australians, without anyone they deem to be undesirable and unworthy of life. Allowing the Nazi swastika to be part of our community and society betrays and violates the convictions that Australians profess to live their lives by and which we hold dear. In 2022, with rising anti-Semitism and bigotry, and with ASIO Director Burgess declaring that neo-Nazis are a serious threat, we are at an inflection point of deciding who we are. This long-deferred reckoning on how to deal with this ugly symbol, a symbol that tells a hole in the heart of so many, must now take place. You can set the tone. You can choose the course. You can take the high moral ground and send an unmistakable message that this symbol will never be part of who we are. For homegrown white supremacists and extremists, the Nazi swastika is the preferred weapon of choice to to terrorize, or fear, and intimidate our community. Permitting the Nazi swastika to defile our streets and skies is a spit in the face of every digger who fought bravely, sacrificed their lives to defeat Hitler's regime. It is a desecration of their memory and the memory of the 6 million Jewish victims and millions of others who were murdered at the hands of the Nazis. And it is a kick in the stomach to the Holocaust survivors who live amongst us. The time for action is now. We must rise to the challenge because fighting the ideology of mass murder, incitement and violent racism should never be a partisan issue. We do the right thing. If you denazify New South Wales, it will be a thunderous victory against those evil forces who wish us harm. And of course, in the background is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in Australia is not history, it is news. Over the last few years, we've seen anti-Semitism rise to levels not seen in Australia before, in schools, in the workplace, at universities, on the streets, and on social media. So I'd just like to finish by saying that a good place to start is to ban once and for all the public display of the Nazi swastika. You and your colleagues have the opportunity to right the wrong, to shut down the neo-Nazis, and to affirm the ideals and principles that we all cherish. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Abramovich, and thank you also for reminding us, although we're not hearing from them today via submissions, that it's important to also remember the other victims of Nazism beyond the Jews, who disproportionately received much of the horrific treatment, but also the 3 million non-Jewish Poles who died in concentration camps, the 4,000 Jehovah's Witnesses, the 500,000 Roma or Romani, or Gypsies as some people call them, and countless numbers of mental and physically disabled people, and also the 10,000 homosexuals who also died in the gas chambers as well. So thank you just for ensuring that we keep this context in mind as well. Dr. Ms. Levine and Dr. Rubenstein, would you like to, would either of you like to make an opening statement on behalf of your organisation?
Yes, I will. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks very much for the invitation for both of us to be here today. I'd like to also apologise for the absence of my colleague, Jeremy Jones, who is unable to be here for health reasons.
Oh, that's a shame.
Now, as our submission makes clear, AJAC fully supports the intent of this amendment to prohibit the public display of Nazi symbols, with a few exceptions, of course. I don't think it's necessary to revisit in any length the reasons why the public display of Nazi symbols is so odious to the overwhelming majority of Australians. But I will just remind the committee that during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Nazi swastika has regrettably become more visible than ever. There seems to be an obsession by some with comparing our public health crisis to the Nazis and their program of genocide. And this rising obsession has brought an urgency to the issue, which we are discussing today. And as mentioned, we've seen the resurgence in particular of anti-Semitism globally, and unfortunately in Australia as well. And to a degree, the normalisation of so much conspiracy rhetoric and theories linked to COVID, and the resurgence of symbols, particularly Nazi hate symbols, or the swastika in particular, in this period. I'd briefly just like to draw the attention of the committee to a couple of points we made in our written submission to the committee. Firstly, the New South Wales Police received 31 reports of Nazi flags being flying in the period 2018 to 20. Alarming as this may seem to be, the number of Nazi flags and other Nazi symbols shared by Australians on social media is likely many magnitudes higher than that number. And this amendment rightly includes communication through social media in its definition of a public act. This is an extremely important, highly significant inclusion, as it provides a legal indicator for social media companies as to where a line must be drawn. And secondly, I'd like to emphasise AJAC's view that this amendment alone, while necessary in our opinion, is certainly not a sufficient anti-vilification or anti-extremism measure. Responding to vilification or racial extremism, particularly from the far right, requires, we would argue, a suite of measures, and I simply refer the committee to the broad-reaching Victorian Parliament, Legislative Assembly, Legal and Social Issue Committee's inquiry into anti-vilification protections and their similar recommendations on banning the swastika, and the very recently published Queensland Parliament's Legal Affairs and Safety Committee inquiry into serious report, particularly recommendation 16, which also recommends making it a criminal offence to display hate symbols, including the swastika. I'll leave my opening comment there, Mr. Chairman, and welcome your questions.
Mr. Secord has asked to go first.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, I'd like to make a declaration. Probably Abramovich is actually my wife's surname, so she's probably a relative of the professor that's in the panel, so I'll make that declaration. Second thing, I'd also like to have Dr. Rubenstein convey to Mr. Jones our support for him as a tireless campaigner against racism, hatred, and anti-Semitism in our community, and his role as an educator and his lifelong commitment to fighting hatred. So can you please extend our best wishes to him? And
certainly will. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Now, I'd like to just make a quick, Dr. Rubenstein, you talked about tackling social media. So it's very clear you support the legislation, and I am open to amendments and changes to perfect or increase or enhance the legislation. How would an amendment involving social media work? And if you would like to, if Ms. Levin would like to add something to that too, I'd appreciate that. Dr. Rubenstein?
I'll let Ms. Levin lead on this.
Okay, thank you.
She's the expert in that field.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the question. We're not proposing any amendments around social media. What we're saying is that we welcome the definition of a public act to include social media. And I think that's very innovative in this space. So we're not just talking about flying a Nazi flag, we're talking about also the digital communication of Nazi symbols. And I think that's a particularly important part of this amendment that needs to be emphasised. And I note that while in Victoria this has been, there is a move to adopt a ban on Nazi symbols, that hasn't been, the legislation hasn't been presented publicly. I would urge all jurisdictions watching this to take note of the inclusion in this particular amendment of social media.
Thank you. Professor Abramovich, can I get a comment from you? Last week, the Gandel Foundation released a report showing that a quarter of Australian adults had no knowledge or little knowledge of the Shoah. How would legislation like this improve that or enhance Shoah Holocaust education? And Dr. Rubenstein, I'll put the same question to you after.
Yeah, thank you for the question. One of the things that I often say is that a democracy is not just about the rights that we have, it's also about what we're willing to tolerate. And I think a New South Wales community, an Australian community that is willing to tolerate the public displays of the Nazi swastika has to do some soul searching. And I think it speaks volumes about where we are. When we come back to the issue of Holocaust education, which I think was a hit to the solar plexus of many of us, although I'm not surprised, a CNN report a few years ago showed a staggering indifference and ignorance in Europe, of all places, about the Holocaust, and similar surveys and research from the United States has produced similar results. I think that the passing of this law, and I'm already conjugating into the future because I hope that the Parliament does embrace our position. By the way, we have campaigned on this for the last 4 years, and we've had, I think, tremendous success in Victoria. I'm very happy about that. I think what it would do is it would forefront and foreground a discussion in the public square about the Holocaust. I think it would stir the souls of many people, and it would force many to have that comfortable conversation that we need to have about the Holocaust, about neo-Nazism, about white supremacists, about extremists. So this law, I think, will be throwing off a rock into a pond. It will create many ripples. But above all, it will send an unmistakable message where the New South Wales Parliament and its elected representatives stand on the issue of Nazism. It will convey unequivocal message that neo-Nazism will never find a legal refuge and a safe haven in the state of New South Wales.
Dr. Rubenstein, the 25% of Australian adults have little or no knowledge of the Holocaust, the Shoah.
Yes, well, this obviously is a very disturbing figure. We commend that Deakin study with the Gandel Foundation support. It does point to the urgency of ensuring adequate Holocaust education, certainly throughout the educational system, and we're on the path to doing that. It needs to be enhanced with that figure, and that report clearly underlined. It also alerts us to the dangers of the wildfire spread of Holocaust distortion and denial, and the emergence of far-right groups in Australia. And we've seen the reports and material out of the Australian Federal Police and from Asia about the wildfire growth of far-right extremist groups, not only the rhetoric and symbolism, but we know that that is a precursor to violent action. And the warning from those authorities is abundantly clear. And turning to social media, I think a key point here is that those social media companies should really be implored to adopt the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism in their operations, and be much more rigorous in terms of what they allow and that they disallow in their transmission. I think similarly, I would say the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is widely accepted by over 30 countries and has bipartisan support, federal and state in this country, is something that we should encourage key sectors of Australian society, particularly in the educational domain, not only to adopt, but to actually use and to implement. So I think, but particularly I commend this proposal in terms of the inclusion of social media, and I think more work to be done in terms of encouraging those guides to incorporate these criteria is extremely important in the world, social media world that we live in, where attitudes are fashioned to such a great extent through that media.
One last question, Ms. Levin, as an analyst, 31 incidents in New South Wales of people flying the Nazi flag, a water tower in Wagga Wagga, a backyard in Newtown across from a synagogue. Now, what do you say, like someone flying a Nazi flag in New South Wales publicly like that, what does that message that they're trying to convey to the community, what are they trying to say?
It's a very good question, and I think we need to note also that's 31 incidents that were reported to the police. So I think we need to be mindful that there could be many more incidents of public displays that just weren't reported to the police. That would be the first point I'd make. I think also that we live in an increasingly polarised world. We live in an increasing world where people are only in their own echo chambers or in their own silos, and COVID has brought on this real phenomenon of people not having extended social interactions beyond people who agree with them. And I think that's perhaps reflected in these public displays, is that you have people who, through social media and other digital communications, are listening to messages, are becoming radicalised, are sticking within a group of people who all agree with each other and who don't doubt or question certain things. And that's radicalising people to these extremes where they do, publicly demonstrate views and opinions and expressions that are, not acceptable to our society. And I think that's very much what these 31 incidents are showing, that as a society we have an increasing problem with people holding these extremist views and not understanding how publicly and socially unacceptable those views are to the general community.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question of each of the organisations just to test what you think the parameters of these sorts of laws are. The first one I'll put to you is based on a German case in the European Court of Human Rights that I guess you may be familiar with. It was back in 2018. It's the Nix case. And it was based on a blog post in 2014 featuring an image of the Nazi chief of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, in uniform with a swastika armband. The Nazi image was used to criticise the German Federal Employment Agency and a staff member over communications regarding educational and vocational arrangements for Nix's daughter. He received a suspended sentence of 4 months imprisonment after appeal. The court acknowledged that Nix did not intend to spread totalitarian propaganda, incite violence or utter hate speech. The necessary, clear and obvious opposition to Naziology was not evident in his blog post. Rather, he had used the Nazi image as a gratuitous, eye-catching device. Do you have any observations about that particular case? Do you think Mr. Nix should have received any sentence, or did the court get it right? And should therefore that guide us how we put the law together here in New South Wales?
I'll have to go first if you wish. Mm-hmm. I mean, as I recall the case very briefly, I think he was angry about the treatment of his daughter or something.
Correct. Yep. I didn't go into all the details. I didn't want to take more than I'd already more time than I'd taken.
Yeah. So as I sort of vaguely remember, one of the things that the court said was that he didn't do enough to distance himself from the ideology of Nazi Germany, and that it was used in a trivial way, in a sense. You know, he was promoting his own political. He was using it in a sense, you know, to pummel his critics and to make a point which was immaterial to the use of the Nazi swastika. And we are seeing, I think, Dr. Rubinstein referred to this fact that over the last 2 years of COVID, we've seen the Nazi swastika being appropriated and being manipulated and abused by anti-vaxxers, by anti-lockdown demonstrators. And the Anti-Defamation Commission has been screaming from the rooftops over many years about the exploitation of the Nazi swastika. That's the case. It is a tough one. I mean, do we want people who are simply using the Nazi swastika, for example, in an article or a blog post, going to jail? And that's not something that I have thought about deeply, because I think the majority of people that we do want prosecuted are the hardcore neo-Nazis, are the white supremacists. And I'll just add to what Ms. Levin said. My view is this: anybody who displays publicly displays the Nazi swastika, be it a flag or an emblem, is celebrating and glorifying Nazi ideology. We should take them at face value and we should believe what they say. And my view is that if anybody violates that law, they should be prosecuted. As for the penalties, I think that's a discussion worth having.
Ajak?
I'd just add the actual text of the amendment, the heading Division 8 is public hate crimes.
Yep.
And I think we need to keep that in mind when thinking about this particular amendment. We're talking about hate crimes, and I don't want to comment on the specifics of the German case because I'm vaguely familiar with it.
Yeah, I understand, yeah.
But I think what we need to keep in mind is we're talking about hate crimes, and you could possibly ask that a person putting a swastika in a blog post is offensive and shouldn't be tolerated, but you probably wouldn't argue that it's a hate crime. So I think that that's relevant in in this discussion that we're having today, and something worth keeping in mind when thinking about how you would prosecute this particular issue.
Thank you. In this case, it was a picture of Himmler wearing a swastika. So, but look, rather than labouring it, I'll ask another question, testing a different aspect of the parameter. In some of the European jurisdictions, for example, Serbia and Germany, production and storage of material with Nazi symbols is outlawed. In Ukraine and Poland, production is outlawed. Whereas in Germany, nevertheless, it's still not illegal to have a private collection of material with Nazi symbols. I wonder if I could get some comments from the two organisations about that, given that in the proposed New South Wales law, production and storage is not outlawed, nor is having a private collection.
Well, my view is that we should put a line through the production of Nazi swastika and Third Reich symbols. And I guess it always comes back to intent, because there are exceptions for artistic and educational purposes. And the question, I think, will hover around, why are they being produced? Is there a play or is there an exhibition that's being staged somewhere whereby you need to produce certain symbols specifically?
A bit like an end-user certificate for armaments manufacturers.
Exactly. So I think the law will have to look at the intent. If you have a group like National Socialist Network who are now producing, and the other question, and I don't know if you'll get to it, if the committee will get to it, and that is the Nazi trade. That is the trade in Nazi memorabilia. I hope that we'll get a chance to talk about this. But to me, it will come back to the issue of intent. Why is it being produced? If it's being produced for nefarious purposes or the public display, and it's not within the frame of educational or artistic, then I think it should be banned.
Hey, Jack?
Yes, well, I'd echo those sentiments. I mean, clearly there are exemptions, be they academic, artistic, or other acceptable exemptions. But given that this material is being used to promote, far-right extremism by the burgeoning far-right groups adopting the Nazi symbols, using the propaganda, one has to think that the significant production of these materials is extremely problematic. And unless there was a clear justification in terms of academic or artistic reasons, I think the balance of the evidence would suggest that this is problematic to allow the production and storage of the material. I think the onus would be on the people producing the material to show that their intent is not to promote hatred.
Mm-hmm. And also, in some of the recent research I've done onto the Australian far right, this is a very relevant question, because there are far-right extremist or far-right right-wing extremist groups at the moment who are producing merchandise for distribution or for sale, for fundraising in Australia. So it is available and it's being promoted, so it's definitely a relevant discussion. Whether it includes Nazi symbols on that merchandise, I can't tell you because I'm not familiar with exactly what they sell, but it is a relevant and contemporary question in Australia.
Thank you. Can I ask Reverend Nile or Abigail Boyd if they have a question they'd like to?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Reverend Nile first and then Abigail. Thank you.
I realised a number of years ago that the movement of the Holocaust deniers would grow, and sadly that's true, and that's why it's so important to have the truth about what happened in World War II to the Jewish people, and I thank all your organisations for continuing along that pathway of educating people. But I sense that there's a lack of education of the Australian people as to the horrors of the Holocaust. And I knew there would be a growth of the Holocaust denier movement. So I actually, at my own expense, went to Poland and visited Auschwitz and other camps to see firsthand the furnaces where Jewish prisoners were burned, their bodies were destroyed and so on in the furnaces. And I just wonder what more can be done, or what more you think should be done to educate the Australian people outside the Jewish community, who are pretty well educated, but the average Australian is pretty well ignorant as to the horrors of the Holocaust, as to how do we convey that today to the modern generation.
If I can go first, I think there are multiple steps that we can take. One, of course, is mandatory Holocaust education. For me, is that Holocaust curriculum should be integrated into every school in the country and should go, whether it's in year 9 or 10. I think we're on the right track. I think New South Wales and Victoria, and I think Queensland may adopt this soon, but I think other states need to jump on board also. So I think that's the first step. I think the establishment of Holocaust museums across the country is a tremendous boon for Holocaust education because it provides a place for young people and for adults to visit, to speak to Holocaust survivors and to witness firsthand the atrocities of the Holocaust. And the third one, which is not often spoken about, is I think that our elected representatives need to use their pulpit much more to condemn anti-Semitism, to condemn extremism, and to reference the Holocaust, to remind people that Hitler was an anti-Semite before he became a final solutionist. Anti-Semitism is not an ideology as such, it is a program to eliminate every Jewish person and anybody who's undesirable. So I've often called on politicians to use their public voice, to use their stature, to use their influence, to not only denounce and to condemn all forms of anti-Semitism and hatred, but also thread into that the Holocaust. We need to generate a discussion in the public square about the Holocaust, about Holocaust education, and about the need for people to inform themselves of what happened, because it can happen again.
Thank you for your answer.
If I could just endorse everything that Dr. Abramowitz has said, but just correct him. So Holocaust education is actually mandatory across the Australian curriculum at the moment, but it does differ in different states and territories as to what is mandated. So in some states and territories there's a certain number of hours that need to be taught, and it does differ, but it is actually mandatory across the Australian curriculum to teach the Holocaust.
Thank you. Do you know, is it within units of history and European history?
My understanding is it's a mandated learning area in the Australian history curriculum from year 7 to 10.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll thank you for clearing that up.
Does it happen?
May I just, I should have mentioned earlier, Reverend Nile, that when talking about victims, I visited the barracks at Dachau, which was built specially for Christian clergymen who stood up to the Nazis as well, but who lost their lives there. Abigail, do you have some questions, Ms. Boyd?
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for submissions and for coming along and also for your continued advocacy in this area. I wanted to touch on that social media question again, because when I asked the Deputy Commissioner in the last session about sort of the enforceability of that provision, he had some concerns. I wanted to, as particularly you, Ms. Levine, as to whether, ask you whether you come across these issues and whether you have any answers. But if I could just put forward a few of the questions I'm thinking of based on the draft bill. For example, if you post, say somebody posted on Facebook a Nazi flag, clearly under the bill we would intend for that person to be criminalised for that display. But how does that impact on a person who is perhaps a moderator of a Facebook group? How does it impact on the company themselves on Facebook? Are they also displaying? Do they have an obligation to do something about that? What if somebody in Queensland, for example, posts and it is seen by somebody in New South Wales? Would that be caught by the legislation? All of these very tricky issues that I know are being dealt with at a federal level. How do you see them working? Do you have any sort of amendments or suggestions for us on how we can make that provision a bit tighter?
It's a very good question, and I think some of those specific examples I'd like to take on notice, if that's okay, Ms. Boyd, because I just don't want to give a knee-jerk, sort of gut reaction. I'd rather think about them a bit more clearly. But I think this, as AJ put in our submission, we think that this legislation does intersect quite significantly with some of the Commonwealth legislation that's just passing, or it's just being implemented at the moment, the Online Safety Act, and then on the Online Safety Determination, because that gives a lot more powers to the eSafety Commission to instruct those social media companies to remove material. So the way I see this particular amendment interacting with that is that in New South Wales you cannot display these Nazi symbols. The eSafety Commissioner could potentially then go to those companies and say, you have displayed these symbols, that is a criminal act in New South Wales, you need to remove them from your platform. So that is how I see that interaction taking place. But again, I'd really like to think about some of those questions and some of those scenarios you just put a bit more deeply. I'd like to reply on notice if that's okay.
Thank you, that'd be really useful. And it makes me think that perhaps the committee should also reach out to the Safety Commissioner for their views and just how we might sort of tighten that up. I will ask, did any of the other witnesses want to chime in on that?
Yes, that's a good thought, Abigail. Are there any follow-up questions on that particular issue?
If I could just add that I think
Colin,
it's clear that...
Go ahead. Oh, we've lost your sound, Colin. Try again.
That was Tavir.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tavir. My apologies. I was looking at you, thinking I was hearing your voice. But Dr. Abramovich, please continue.
I was just going to say that it's clear to everybody that the new landscape, new frontier, is the digital one. And we are seeing an enormous amount of Nazi symbols being posted across the world on so many different media platforms. And of course, the absurd thing is that you look at most of the community guidelines, those symbols of hate are prohibited. In fact, just last week we alerted, for example, Facebook Australia, that we have quite a good relationship with, that somebody was selling Nazi memorabilia on the community or marketplace, and they immediately removed it. So I think the issue is that we need to make sure that those digital companies actually enforce their own laws. I mean, that's the issue, because most of them would not endorse or accept the posting of the Nazi swastika or other Third Reich symbols. The problem is that we often alert them to the incidents. They either ignore it or they come back with an automatic response saying, thank you, we've received it, it doesn't violate our community guidelines because they haven't checked it. So I think that's an important issue to emphasize, that we need to actually press those internet companies to enforce their own laws.
Mr. Chair, can I jump in with a follow-up question on social media? Ms. Levin, can you explain the concept of triple brackets, this thing where you see three parentheses sort of making an echo symbol? And Dr. Abramovich, can you also respond to that? Is that a neo-Nazi also a symbol, and can you explain that?
It is a neo-Nazi symbol. I've seen it around. I've never done any specific research into it myself. Maybe, Tavir, do you have any more insight?
Yeah, so, yes, absolutely. It's multiple, it's called the echo. It's a kind of typographical practice which anti-Semites use online. And what you do is you just use three pairs of parentheses or brackets around someone's name. And it's intended to let others in the know that the person that is being referred to is Jewish. So sometimes you see the word banker, and they'll put it around the word banker, so that the idea is that the word Jewish is placed in front of the term or phrase. And we've seen, I think it's been around for about 6 or 7 years, and it was first used in podcasts, but today we are seeing more and more anti-Semites, white supremacists, neo-Nazis using inverted parentheses on their own screen names to indicate that they're not Jewish. So it's become very, very common, and it certainly is an anti-Semitic symbol.
But can I
There are a lot of symbols like this that exist, and the idea is to try and get through some of the filters that social media companies have put in place to try and automatically weed out offensive terms. So instead of writing, offensive words that any sort of artificial intelligence could pick up and get rid of, these groups are increasingly sophisticated in using coded language to try and get their points across. And I know the ADL in the United States has almost a glossary it's constantly updated of all the coded language that's being used by these groups to make offensive remarks without being picked up by these filters.
Thank you.
All right then. We might have time for one last question. The next witnesses are waiting in the digital lobby, so to speak. But we do. Yes, Peter Primrose.
Just very briefly, and to any of the witnesses who'd like to answer, we had a brief mention earlier about the appropriation of Nazi symbols by extremist groups, anti-vaxxers and others. Can you basically say what you think passage of this proposed legislation would have on the use of those symbols by those other groups?
I'm happy for this.
That's okay. I think that there's some separate issues here, and some of them, as Vera was alluding to earlier, require community leadership to stamp out rather than legislation. So that's that whole, comparisons to the Holocaust that these anti-vax movements use and increasingly use. I don't know if a lot of that is necessarily a hate crime or is necessarily inciting to violence, but we need the community leadership to talk about how unacceptable it is and how that discourse and that rhetoric has no place in our community. So I'm not sure that there's a place for legislation in that as opposed to leadership. Having said that, those groups radicalise very quickly. So they start as a fairly benign anti-vax movement and quickly move into racial incitement, vilification, and as part of that appropriating Nazi symbols. And that's where I think this amendment can intersect with what those groups are doing.
Yes, and just to add on, of course, online radicalization, that's how the Christchurch killer became a mass murderer. So it's very, very important. And the other thing, of course, is that for Holocaust survivors and for the descendants of Holocaust survivors, seeing the Nazi swastika is like being threatened with a gun. It's that serious. So we have to really, in a sense, pour all our energies and effort into making sure that every single elected representative uses the stage to condemn and denounce any use and any misappropriation of those symbols.
If I could just add, to emphasise the point, the supreme importance of bipartisan political leadership in maintaining the values of Australian multicultural democracy. I think that's critically important as part of also a national anti-racism strategy and social media strategy. And I commend the New South Wales Parliament for its initiative with this particular this particular proposal. The explosion of the far right in Australia, which is amply documented by ASIO and federal police, is a very serious matter. It's a direct threat to the Australian Jewish community, but it's a profound threat to the future viability of Australian multicultural society and our democracy. So I commend the committee again for its work in this area.
Thank you.
All right then. Well, look, it just remains for me to say thank you very much. I think there's been an excellent interplay of ideas and where we're heading on this information, and all three of you have brought a great deal to the table in terms of our deliberation. So sincere thanks, and it being 12 o'clock, may I wish you good afternoon. Have an excellent one, and hopefully we'll have cause to see you again on some occasion socially.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we'll just check if... Thank you. Now we'll just check to see who we've got in the... looks like we've got them both. Can we do a sound check? Anthony?
Yes, good afternoon.
Right, and... Oh, and Mr. Simon, you're with us as well?
Yes, well, good afternoon.
Can hear you.
Excellent. The sound level is excellent. We can hear you loud and clear. So may I commence by asking both of you in order to please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation from the cards that you have been sent by email by our committee secretariat. And may I start with Mr. Simon?
I swear by that evidence now about be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. My name is Joseph. So help me God.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simon. And I should just make sure that all of the committee members know that Mr. Simons is 97 years old. I hope you don't mind me revealing your age. And a Holocaust survivor. And we're delighted that he has his wife and daughter with him as well to assist him provide his perspective to the committee. And we're very grateful for them making their time as well. Mr. Is it Levine or Levin? Which do you prefer?
Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Would you mind swearing the oath as well, please, or affirmation?
Yes, so my name is Anthony Levin, and I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levin. Now, I'm going to invite each of you to make a short statement, if you would like to, and I'll start with Mr. Simon.
Yes, first of all, I hope and request that that statement document is right in front of you.
Yes.
And as a Holocaust survivor, I'm committed doing everything I can to communicate, educate, and increase the awareness of the Holocaust and the murder of 6 million Jews, including a large number of my family, including my father, and among the 6 million Jews, 1.5 million children. It's all driven by hate, discrimination, and social injustice, and reinforced by Nazi symbols, particularly the swastika, the most recognizable symbol of the Nazi regime, the strong and enduring message, never again.
Indeed. Thank you, Mr. Simon. And committee members, Mr. Simon also has a document that he's provided which he would like as an addendum to his opening statement. Is there any objection to that being tabled? No. There's no objection. Thank you very much for providing that statement as well, Mr. Simon. Was there anything else you wish to add at this stage?
Well, in this stage, I would like to emphasize it, that I've been taken, like every Jew in Hungary, over the age of 18 to forced labor camp. And that was the time when, although it was not allowed to listen to any other radio station except the Hungarian or the Nazi, German, and you could pick and choose which liar you wanted to hear. So, but if you had, well, I would say guts, brave enough, there was 2 stations available for those who were willing to take the risk and not worrying about the punishment, listening to these two stations. One of them was the Voice of America, and the other one from London, the Free Europe. These two stations told you day by day what's happening with the Jews all over Europe, and unfortunately, we've been informed with all the deportation, the concentration camps, the gas chambers, the crematoria. In other words, we knew exactly what happened. And it was a time I have decided it's not going to happen to me. I will make every effort to find my way to not to be part of that discrimination. I will endeavor later on for details, if you're interested, what happened to me later on.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. Mr. Levin, would you like to make an opening statement?
Yes, just a very short one, thank you. And thank you to the committee members for inviting us to appear today. I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Darug and Baringai people, the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm talking to you today. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. As I said, my name is Anthony Levin. I am the immediate past Vice President of the Australian Association of Holocaust Survivors and Descendants. I served in that role for 8 years until last year. I'm also the grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors, one of whom is still alive and survived 5 different concentration camps. I'm also the co-founder of a community organisation called the Gen 3 Network, and its purpose is to facilitate discussion between third-generation descendants and their peers in the Jewish community, largely about Holocaust commemoration and social justice issues. I mention these matters because it may help the committee in framing its questions to me or to Mr. Simon. I also know in my professional life I work as a human rights lawyer with over 15 years' experience, and so to the extent that the committee is amenable, I'm happy to answer questions which go to any of the human rights or other legal implications of the bill, in particular questions you've already posed to other witnesses about striking the appropriate balance between freedoms and the responsibility to protect vulnerable groups. I also echo the sentiments of Mr. Simon already made in his opening statement. Indeed, for many descendants of survivors and younger Jewish people, the impact of seeing Nazi symbols in the street, for example, during anti-lockdown protest rallies, is very visceral and psychologically disturbing. And if those are left unchallenged, then they do violence to the cause for peace and harmony in a plural society like ours. Granted, I think we have to do everything that we can to make our society anti-fragile, meaning that when the political environment becomes volatile, we must look for ways to strengthen our principled foundations. And arguably, the greatest challenge to the efficacy of this proposed law, in our view, is that these ideologies are constantly evolving, especially in terms of the use of symbols online. I'd be happy to receive questions on that from the committee further in trying to establish a precedent for a principles-based approach to the deterrence of hatred. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levin. Is there any committee member who'd like to go first, since I've nominated someone to go first for all the others? Abigail, you were quick first off the mark. Ms. Abigail Boyd.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the two of you for coming along today. I think that your submission, your evidence raises a really, really important point about, and I guess it reflects on some of the discussion we were having before about the lack of education, or the seeming lack of awareness amongst Australians as to what the Holocaust was and what it means. And I wanted to ask you about not just the outward, the use of Nazi symbols in a sort of deliberately anti-Semitic way. So even the casual use in a more sort of by well-meaning person or relatively well-meaning person of words like Nazi to describe, grammar Nazi, for example, is quite common, or comparing certain things to concentration camps. That trivialisation of the experience of Holocaust survivors and of the import of the event itself, as well as now this sort of taking on of Nazi symbols by the far right. Could you explain to us how that exacerbates the trauma for Holocaust survivors and descendants, and what that really means to you? Please,
yes, Mr. Simon.
Well, first of all, personally, for me, as soon as I can see anything, any information related to Nazi Germany, it automatically brings back very vivid memories, all the suffering and the horror, what people, my people, and other people. Please remember, we are not talking strictly only the 6 million Jews. We are talking about many millions of people. And I can give you samples, because according to the Nazis, every Slovak people, and you can call them the Croatian, the Serb, the Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Macedonia, Albania, and of course the Poles, they are subhuman. They shouldn't be in the world, including the Jews, of course, as number one. And that was the Nazi aim, to wipe out the Jews forever. And that memories becoming very, very much alive as soon as I can see the swastika or any other documentation about Nazi Germany. It is helped me to reinforce my very, very strong commitment for educating people, talk about as much as possible, because we are talking strictly about hate, and that's what I'm fighting against. That's what I try to educate people and explain to them the danger of it, because that hate eventually ends up with killing. And that's what I personally, on behalf of the ones who can't speak anymore, the ones who destroy, and I'm talking in their behalf, to make people understand the danger of what behind the word of hate.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Any response on this issue?
Maybe just to briefly address this issue of trivialisation. I mean, I think there are a number of points to unpack in your question, Ms. Boyd, one of which is possible comparison to concentration camps in other contexts. I think that is a slightly vexing and vexed issue. If you look at the scholarship of someone like Dan Stone, for example, who's explored the historical use of concentration camps that predate the Holocaust by many years, you can begin to see that there are legitimate instances where we can have public discourse about what a concentration camp is. However, I think more pointedly in this case, most, and I don't speak for survivors and I don't purport to, nor do I purport to speak for descendants, but I can speak to my conversations with them and their experiences as related to me. And I think it's fair to say that many survivors would feel affronted by those kinds of comparisons, and they would feel equally affronted by casual use of the term Nazi in contexts, be it grammar or otherwise. Descendants, being a very heterogeneous group, might have a slightly less sensitised response to those examples, but that doesn't mean that there won't be quarters of the community that aren't offended by them. In fact, I think that there are people who are offended by that kind of casual usage. Whether that is or should be the province of this bill is a different question. I think it comes back to the dual purpose of the bill that you've already spoken about earlier this morning in other sessions, in that it is designed, as far as I understand it, to both protect members of the community who are vulnerable, minority groups, but also to deter the display and to create this new offence. And I would say in that regard, I would try to keep that purpose in mind when thinking about these somewhat lesser instances which you might describe as trivial or even flippant, and whether they are properly within the scope of what is designed here to be captured by the proposed offence.
Thank you very much. Any follow-up, Abigail, at this stage?
Just to comment that, yes, absolutely agree. I don't think it's something that should be caught by this bill, but I think that element of trivialisation of Nazi images and Nazi symbols, so I guess leads to some people not understanding the import and why we might want to ban Nazi symbols. Thank you for your answers. Very good.
Walt?
Yes. Mr. Levin, you mentioned online activity. Can you offer some advice or observations on how if we were to amend the bill or change the bill, how we would incorporate online activity?
Yes, I think this is quite difficult, and I know you've had other witnesses appear who are more expert than I am in these matters and commenting on them. I would start by saying that there have been comments earlier today about whether by creating a prohibition or criminalising the display of Nazi symbols, you force the groups that use them underground. I would say that I would probably query the meaning of underground there, because many of these groups are already underground. If you look at the kinds of forums where they appear, places like messaging boards like 4chan, 8chan, or Discord, or even on Telegram, those platforms contain anonymous users who are already not particularly visible and require law enforcement to investigate to identify who they are. I don't believe that this kind of proposed bill would force them further underground, and I think that possibly misapprehends the way that those groups seek to mobilise, recruit and expand in the first place. But I don't know that I'm best placed to offer advice on how to properly capture the conduct of those people online, other than to say that we ought to think broadly about the meaning of Nazi symbols. Perhaps a lot of thought has already gone into this, but in a country like Austria, for example, they've banned up to 30 different kinds of symbols, which acknowledges the fact that they become very encoded in the online environment. The use of numbers, for example, such as 1488 or 420, which are coded references to various aspects of Hitler and Holocaust history, those are less easy to notice and maybe less known to the community. So I would suggest that it would be important to think about in drafting or in any amendments that might be considered in future after this inquiry, whether the bill is able to capture those instances of people using numbers and coded references. A reference was made earlier by Peter Wertheim to the now notorious triple parentheses used, which is a kind of digital equivalent of a gold star, and I've been on the receiving end of this on Twitter. But there are other usages which are far less obvious but understood within the very, these messaging groups and online cabals that wouldn't necessarily be obvious to you or I. And I imagine the Anti-Defamation League and similar groups are monitoring those kinds of things.
Mr. Simon, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to ask you a particularly direct question. How do you feel when you see a Nazi flag or a depiction of a Nazi flag on the streets of Australia? What does that make you feel?
Well, the straightforward answer would be very, very disturbed. But it goes far beyond that, because what I never mentioned, that I had the good fortune to be invited and work in the Hungarian Jewish underground. And through that period of time, I had the pleasure to meet people who later on became saving a number of Jewish lives, became the righteous among the nation. And that discussion with these people made me determined that the important part of my work has to be education. Talk to people, explain what is behind a Nazi flag is the swastika. And that's all hatred. A hatred by the Nazis, not only the Jews. I did emphasize, but I have to repeat it. Not only the Jews, but people, anybody who was against them. And for that reason, still today, the sign of any Nazi flags with the swastika is very disturbing for me.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. One last, Mr. Chair, one last question to Anthony Levin. Mr. Levin, in your opening remarks, you touched on the debate or the argument of freedom of speech. And I do not hold this view, but the offensive view that someone in the community has the right to be a bigot. How do you respond to that? And I find that view absolutely abhorrent, and I don't think you have a right to be a bigot, and you don't have a right to espouse those views. But you, as a human rights lawyer, how do you navigate this terrain?
Yes, well, I think we're all familiar with some of the debates that unfolded during the 18C inquiry and discourse in the media. I think I agree with your sentiments completely, and I imagine that members of our association would also completely agree, as those who've experienced that kind of bigotry and the violence that has flown from it throughout history. In human rights, there is almost always a competition between certain kinds of rights, and the test that's typically used to adjudicate that competition is one of proportionality. In this case, you might say, if you are a strict libertarian, for example, that a person has the right that you've offered in the premise of your question, I plainly disagree with that. And the reason I think it's rational and sound to disagree with it is because we also have the right to be free from restraint and violence from others. And the limits on our freedoms are actually one of the hallmarks of a mature liberal democracy. That is to say that a person, and we're in the territory of negative liberty here, a person doesn't have the right to go and incite violence, either by verbal or non-verbal expressions and symbols, which may impinge on the rights and freedoms of others. And that's exactly what we're talking about today. These Nazi symbols, as I alluded to in the opening, they are a form of psychological violence. They are triggering for survivors, and they are triggering for descendants who, and I can attest to my own visceral reaction when I witnessed a man in the eastern suburbs, near a beach in the eastern suburbs, with his shirt off, with a very large swastika tattooed on his chest. And I drew breath sharply because I found this so affronting, and it had such a visceral impact on me. And I don't think I would be alone, and I don't think you need to be Jewish or a descendant to experience that either. The balance of these rights is written into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You look at Article 29, which basically says that nations have an obligation not to disseminate racist ideas and to take steps to eradicate notions of racial purity. What is Nazi symbolism if not a way of signifying that kind of racial superiority? And it must be eradicated, and we must send a strong message about it. And so I would just reiterate that we strongly support this bill, albeit that we may discuss in the ensuing minutes ways to adjust it or improve it.
Could I ask a question, Mr. Levin?
Yes, I think Mr. Simon's indicating that he'd like to make a brief contribution on that same issue.
The only thing I would like to draw your attention, if I may, that my statement document, which has tabled, the last entry of it, which I will read it again, because I feel that the essence and the importance of all the question which we are talking about at the moment. And that's sounds like follows. Having the use of Nazi symbols legal, in my view, inhibits the work of communities and the government to create and maintain an inclusive society that is independent by tolerance and harmony. It inhibits the fight against racism, bullying, anti-Semitism, discrimination, and social injustice. Thank you.
Thank you. Fred?
I'm just going to follow up with another question regarding the increasing anti-Semitic attacks, which are really anti-Jewish attacks in our society. How do we combat that, especially the subtle ones, which are anti-Semitic, which are really, as I said, anti-Jewish? How do we educate the Australian
Mr.
people?
Simon, we just seem to have lost your sound. I wonder if you could try again. We're right now. Good. Yes, we can now. Yes, thank you.
My answer is unchanged. Education. We have to talk people, we have to explain, just like my lovely colleague, Olga Hora, who myself and she particularly working in the Jewish Museum, encouraged to care and taking every minute possible to given to us, explain to people the danger, what the society, not the Jews, the society is having problems, difficulties, and pain because the existence, the legal existence of the Nazi symbols.
Thank you. Mr. Levin?
Yes, I mean, full disclosure, Olga Horek is my grandmother, so I obviously support the work and that she and Mr. Simon and many others have been doing for many, many years now through the association, but also through the Sydney Jewish Museum. And that, I suppose, brings me to a point that might be relevant to answering the question, which is I completely concur that we need more educational measures, and you might say, well, what already exists? And you are probably already familiar with the fact that thousands of school students pass through the Sydney Jewish Museum every year. At last count, when I was serving on the Jewish Museum Board, something in the vicinity of 25,000. Obviously, that number would have been affected drastically by COVID restrictions, but that is an average kind of number in recent years. Now, that's a lot of school children, but it's not a mandatory program, and you may well say, well, why isn't Holocaust education, or indeed civics and ethics education, a more mandatory aspect of the curriculum in addressing these kinds of issues? I'm not an expert, and I am not familiar with the parameters of the current curriculum, and it may well be that there are aspects, but I'm not aware that they are mandatory. I'm also not aware of mandatory training in the public service. I know that members of the police force do attend the museum and undertake conversations with survivors and learn about Holocaust history. But again, I'm not aware that it is a mandatory thing. You may say that it is for each public sector agency to determine what kind of training it does, but there's definite benefits in introducing these kinds of modules as part of a normal orientation and induction program when a person joins. And these kinds of measures addressing the youngest generation, but also addressing members of the public who work in public service and are dealing with the public every day, those would go some way to improving the levels of understanding and drawing that statistic of 1 in 4 Australians down even lower, so that we have a much stronger knowledge base.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Fallow or Mr. Poulos, anything at this stage? We've got about
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep.
I just want to ask for both Mr. Simon and Mr. Levin. We've, of course, I think, Mr. Levin, you alluded to this a little earlier, ways of potentially improving the bill. And one of those ways that has been described by the Deputy Police Commissioner was in terms of a lawful excuse list potentially attached to the bill, which would allow for things like education for movies and artistic works and the like. But that would be a lawful excuse. Do you have any commentary on that and how you think that could operate and what that would mean for you?
And with, pardon for interrupting at this stage, but could you also consider that in the context also of what the submission from the Anti-Discrimination New South Wales is, and that prospective exemption model that's in the bill?
Certainly. I would say that a inclusive list of lawful excuses would be very helpful. I listened to as much of the evidence of the Deputy Commissioner as I could and other witnesses, and I agree with the submissions that have been made about the about needing to use. So maybe if I could just frame it this way, that what we want to do is separate a civil and administrative legal process from a criminal and law enforcement one. Now, the present proposal of using the exemptions, I think, could be improved, and I would suggest, in agreement with earlier evidence, that a defence or exception regime is preferable, because it would enable law enforcement to exercise discretion in who to prosecute. So I hope that addresses that aspect of the question. And with regards to a list of lawful excuses, we're all now very familiar with the operation of what were called reasonable excuses during the first public health orders. The public became familiar with this maybe for the first time. Those kinds of lists of excuses are very common in criminal law. And here, if we talk about lawful excuses, you could create a similar kind of list, and that list need not be an exclusive list. In fact, when you use terms like including in legislation, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you, they are considered by the courts as terms of enlargement, meaning that they don't define the parameters completely, and that it is possible that there could be others. Now, that's a question for the committee and indeed for government to consider. That is it appropriate to absolutely delimit the kinds of excuses and make that clear, or should the list of excuses be indicative only? I think some amount of discretion on behalf of police is appropriate. I think it's appropriate for law enforcement to be the ones that determine whether to prosecute, because there will be myriad examples, as the Anti-Discrimination Board submission pointed out, of people needing such exemptions, and it will be administratively burdensome. And it also, ultimately, in my view, and I agree with them on this, it goes against the tenor of that exemption regime, which was fundamentally designed almost as an affirmative action regime to help people who are affected by unlawful discrimination to be able to be promoted, or their rights to be promoted. So I think there'd be real benefit in re-examining that view.
Thank you. And one further question. Sorry, Mr. Simon, did you want to contribute to that as well?
Well, my comment is basically depends on what's going to happen now, because the legality of any Nazi symbols goes against what not only this committee tried to achieve, which is very commendable, but it goes against the basic principles of our present government. Therefore, it is highly counterproductive to allow these people talk about freely everything which against anything what human decency would otherwise would allow.
Thank you, Mr. Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. And I might just follow on that tenor as well, in terms of another suggestion or comment that was made earlier today, with respect to, this is a strict liability offence as it is in the legislation, in exhibiting and the public display of the Nazi symbol. And there was some talk earlier today about having an intent attached to that as well, as has been used in other legislation. But I take it from particularly your comments that you made immediately the attachment with things such as the BDS movement, anti-vaxxers and the like, and those who protested against lockdowns and the like, misappropriating the Nazi symbol for those causes, whether there is an intent for anti-Semitism or an intent to incite violence or the like, that doesn't really matter when it comes to you and the response that you have when you see that symbol used. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That biggest danger that the extreme right wing, any opportunity they will use, hiding behind its symbols, going against anything what humanly obvious and desirable. So for in no any other reason, that will be more than enough to make that symbols illegal.
Yeah. Mr. Levin?
Sorry to
No. I think Mr. Simon had finished. Yep, go on.
If I could just add to those comments by saying that I think this goes to an earlier question which you posed, Ms. Boyd, which is that these symbols may have a tendency to normalise their visibility in society, and that is one of the precursors to historical examples of genocide. We know that the normalisation of terms of denigration, symbols of hate, and other things which are not exclusive to the Holocaust and have happened in other genocides, including in Rwanda, they are the early warning signs, and we do not want a society in which we tolerate those kinds of things. And I think that it's really incumbent on us to approach it both from that protective viewpoint, but also from a deterrent viewpoint, to be able to say that we must take steps not to normalise and to make it clear, alongside a raft of educational measures to help people understand just how truly horrific the Holocaust was. I guess I also wanted to make a comment on this notion of strict liability briefly, if I could, which is that there was evidence given in the Victorian inquiry about the difficulty of there being two problems with prosecuting crimes in that jurisdiction. One being the difficulty of making a complaint, but also another being the high bar required for prosecution. And we've also seen in New South Wales that we haven't seen many prosecutions, and the Deputy Commissioner gave evidence earlier of 2 that are on foot. But that's not many in the context of 131 or 112 reported incidents and 31 anti-Semitic incidents. I would say we should avoid things that may make it more difficult to prosecute such crimes. And I query whether the threshold of requiring DPP approval before such prosecution is the right level of threshold.
Right. Thank you. Well, look, we have just a little bit of time left, so I might conclude with 1 or 2 questions, in particular to Mr. Levin. And may I say, it is very helpful having a lawyer practicing in the area with us today. So thank you, Anthony. In particular, I think during your opening statement, you invited the committee to look at a few areas where you'd be happy to provide some extra information, and I think we have touched on some of those, but I'm going to give you a free pass and say, what have we missed? What else do you think we need to know?
Well, look, I appreciate your comments, firstly, as the chair of that this committee. I would say that there's already been some discussion of what has happened in Victoria. There was evidence given there by the Human Rights Law Centre about the benefits or relative merits of a principles-based approach, which would capture a wider array of symbols. And my question is, especially in light of the joint submission given earlier by the Hindu, Buddhist and Jainist communities with the Jewish community, is how are we going to tackle those use of symbols that may not be recognisable to me as a member of the Jewish community or to you as a person who's familiar with history, but are familiar to particular minority groups? What steps should we be taking? And you may say, one argument, and I think it's a rational one, is to say that we need to establish a precedent, that this perhaps is the first tranche of laws to deal with this problem in society. But with the rise of extremism, we are likely to see other examples of symbols of hate being used, and that we will need to come up with either amendments to the Crimes Act or other measures to address those. I don't know that it's necessary to address them all, and indeed there are going to be grey areas. I mean, that is the nature of the law. Those grey areas are best adjudicated by the courts, and we shouldn't allow the fact that greyness exists to inhibit our desire to make really important reforms in this space. So I think that there is a rationale for an incremental approach. But I do point to this notion of a principles-based approach, which is broader than just Nazi symbols and would allow us to look at, okay, what are the kinds of symbols that incite hatred, racial animosity, or religious or animosity on other grounds that are otherwise protected by our discrimination laws?
Okay, then. Thank you very much. So I think I think it would be appropriate to give the very last word, given his everything that he's gone through and his remarkable 97-year-old life, to Mr. Simon. The last word is with you.
Here.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank the committee giving the opportunity to discuss that subject, and I sincerely hope that you will be successful in your endeavor and that legality is going to be wiped out. And I wish you all the very best and hope you will be successful.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Simon, and Mr. Levin as well, for your time this morning. Both of you have been exceptionally helpful in the material you've given the committee. And it only remains me to say have a lovely afternoon. And Mr. Simon, keep well.
Thank you.
You too, Mr. Levin. Thank you very much. Righto.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. And this concludes the hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you.